Welcome to another episode of Mr. Warren's Audio Hood. This is episode 4, and in today's episode we will be discussing the following. Condenser microphones, microphone patterns,
All aboard!
Dr. Valentino, Dr. Valentino, to the OR, Valentino, to the OR,
Welcome to Dr. McQuack's Microphone Technology and Cosmetic Surgery Hospital. We specialize in butt lifts, boob lifts, chin jobs, and microphone technology. Today's episode we will discuss condenser microphones and microphone patterns. This is a dynamic cardioid microphone. This is a condenser hypercardioid microphone. This is a studio condenser microphone that has multiple patterns. This is a condenser cardioid handheld microphone. And this is your typical short shotgun microphone. We will discuss these things and more in today's episode. As example, this is Chinese birth control. Works 50% of the time. This is redneck birth control. Works 100% of the time.
Dr. Valentino, Dr. Valentino, to the OR, Valentino, Dr. Valentino, to the OR.
We have previously discussed dynamic microphones and how they work. In this episode, we will enter the exciting world of condenser microphones, and it's a big, expensive city. While dynamic microphones are all types, are the workhorses of the business, condensers are probably the pretty girls of the industry. Dynamic microphones are generally much less expensive to manufacture and produce than condensers are, at least as far as professional microphones are concerned. Dynamic microphones, as with their kissing cousins, speakers, are simple mechanical things, which work based on physical movement caused by fluctuations in air pressure from vibrations. Condenser microphones do not so much move with those same fluctuations in air, but merely stretch or deform slightly, in fact nearly microscopically in response to those vibrations. Condenser microphones have a diaphragm, as a dynamic microphone does, except it's a lot thinner and considerably more delicate. Electronically speaking, condenser microphones are the equivalent of a capacitor in an electronic circuit, while a dynamic microphone, by virtue of the coil of wire wrapped around the voice coil cone and inside the magnet, is an inductor. In its simplest form, a capacitor is an insulating layer with two conducting layers, one on either side of it. The very earliest capacitors, going back to Ben Franklin, were nothing more than a sheet of glass with copper plating or some kind of metal stuck to either side of it. The surface area and thickness of the glass affect the capacitance, which is measured in farads, abbreviated as F, or in most cases in an electronic circuit, it's a fraction of that, a microfarad or a picofarad, using these symbols here. In a condenser microphone, the diaphragm is typically made from a very thin sheet of insulating material, typically mylar, which has been layered with a very thin metallic film on top of the mylar. Typically that's gold or some type of nickel, silver, and in some rare cases titanium. This is done by sputtering the mylar with the metallic element. This basically implies placing a piece of the metal, whatever that might be, gold, silver, nickel, silver, whatever the thing is, into a vacuum chamber, along with the material to be deposited on, be that mylar or glass, whatever the case is. And basically the metal is ionized and electron deposited on the surface of that material. A very, very thin layer, maybe only an atom or two thick. This video shows that process in action. If you've ever seen dichroic lighting filters, which are glass that you can angle a little bit into the light and will change to different colors depending on which angle the light is hitting it at, those are produced by the same process by using various elements to create different colors in the coatings. The mylar film is stretched over a frame and held in place with a slight bit of tension, sort of like the skin of a drum. An electrical contact is made to the sputtered surface and to the backside of the diaphragm, which is referred to as the back plane. This overall construct forms a very basic capacitor. In electronic circuit, capacitors are used to store an electrical charge. Somewhat like a battery, but not for the same term of time. This is where a very important distinction in different types of condenser microphones comes into play. There are two general types of condenser microphones: electret and true condensers. Electret microphones are physically constructed similar to a true condenser, except for, electronically speaking, an electret holds a permanent charge, whereas a true condenser requires an electrical charge to be placed across the diaphragm, which is called a polarization voltage, by an external source. An electret will have a permanent polarization voltage. Typically, electret condensers are smaller diaphragms, and true condensers, for the most part, are larger size diaphragms. Electret condensers are typically less expensive in certain form factors to make, in that that's the type of microphone you might find inside of a cell phone or a cheap toy, or in the old days in an answering machine. Those type of microphones are made in bulk for probably less than $1 a piece. Those aren't of near the quality performance for any sort of professional application. True condensers, as I said, are usually a larger size diaphragm, but not always, but most of the time. And in some cases, they actually have two diaphragms, a front plate and a back plate, with a center common arrangement. The recent proliferation of mass-produced condenser microphones from China has made condenser microphones of a high quality more affordable and accessible. The reason the Neumann U87 costs $3,500 is because it's a handmade microphone, much the way a Rolls-Royce is a handmade car. It is not that all Chinese knockoffs are bad. It's like anything else, you get what you pay for. The Neumann will sound the same today as it does 30 years from now, whereas the $200 Chinese knockoff might not sound the same 2 years from now. The diaphragm of a condenser microphone is held under slight tension across its frame. The frame itself resembles a miniature embroidery hoop. As changes in air pressure occur at the diaphragm from vibration, these cause minuscule changes in tension, which are amplified by a preamplifier circuit in the microphone body and converted into a signal to be further amplified as needed with the audio console or whatever else might be further down the pipe. Some more expensive electret style units use what's referred to as an RF tank circuit to produce the signal. Basically, the diaphragm is included as part of a simple AM radio style transmitter circuit, and the preamplifier essentially acts like a miniature receiver and strips out the RF part of that, leaving the audio component available for use. The reason this is done is to compensate for changes across the electret capsule from humidity in the air. Every microphone has at least one polar pattern or so-called pickup pattern, very much the same way that every speaker has a specific dispersion pattern. A microphone will have a polar pattern versus a dispersion pattern. Some microphones actually have several patterns available, and some can even produce patterns in between those standard patterns. The basic patterns are this: omni, or so-called omnidirectional, depending on how you want to pronounce it. Omnidirectional microphones, as the name implies, pick up sound from all directions, as in omnidirectional, rejecting nothing. A cardioid, or heart-shaped pattern, is a slightly directional pattern which will typically reject most sounds from the back of the microphone element. A hypercardioid is a slightly more directional version of a cardioid microphone with even more side and rear rejection. A supercardioid microphone is an even more directional version of a hypercardioid microphone, with more of a center focus and ignoring more and more information from the sides and the rear. Typically, this is also another name for a shotgun microphone. A shotgun microphone is so named because it resembles the barrel of a gun. Shotgun microphones come in short-barreled versions and long-barreled versions and are used according to the need. Figure of 8 or figure 8 microphones are microphones that are typically side addressed, having a front and back face. The polar pattern, when viewed from above the top of the microphone, is exactly as it implies. Two round circles, one facing forward, one facing backwards. In most condenser microphones, that also implies that the front face is in phase and the rear face is out of phase. But this is not always the case. The key thing and the reason why figure of 8 microphones are used in some situations is that the sides of the microphone reject pretty much anything coming at it. So if you have something you want to focus on and you want to ignore the thing next to it, you can angle a figure 8 microphone so that it will ignore and reject a nearby sound source. The problem is, because it has that rear lobe, you can run into problems with the figure of 8 microphone picking up too much room noise from the rear side, because it will acknowledge and accept that sound. There are several basic rules that apply to microphones with regards to polar patterns. The more directional, the more sensitive the mic will be to handling noises. So a shotgun microphone is very sensitive to being handled and manipulated. An omnidirectional microphone is almost unfazed by that. A cardioid microphone has handling noise, and it gets worse and worse as you get more directional. This is why most handheld cardioid microphones, whether they're dynamics or condensers, will have a lot of foam insulation or rubber insulation inside of it to act as vibration damping material, or a shock mount. Any microphone, no matter how directional it might be within a close space, at a certain distance becomes omnidirectional anyway. So if you're outdoors with your shotgun microphone, even the nice long super directional one, and you're trying to record somebody's dialogue, at a certain distance the sound of a passing train is still going to be picked up because it's basically coming from everywhere. The microphone can't effectively reject it. It's just a question as to how loud that unwanted signal is compared to the one that you do want. Shotgun microphones, though being extremely directional, always have some side and rear lobes. Viewed as a drawing from above, the typical shotgun microphone's polar pattern looks like some sort of a variation on a very strange phallic symbol, with the business end of the microphone having a nice long cylindrical narrow pickup pattern. It will have two slight rear lobes sticking out the sides, which look kind of like ears or something similar, where it still picks up sound that you may not want. So it's something you have to be aware of when using a shotgun microphone. Another key thing about shotgun microphones is that the longer one might be a wonderful tool for picking up somebody's dialogue outdoors at a distance. Using that same long shotgun microphone in a small space, like in an elevator, to record dialogue is not typically a good idea, because those side and rear lobes come into play heavily in a small space like that, especially a small boxy space, because those side and rear lobes tend to be most active around the lower mid-range frequency spectrum. In which case, a small hypercardioid or a short shotgun would probably be a more appropriate tool in a small enclosed space like that. This is also the reason why a lot of TV reporters and on-air interviewers will use an omnidirectional microphone to ask questions of an interviewee, because you don't always have to be right on the person for the microphone to pick it up. If you use a very directional or a cardioid microphone and the person moves their head, or they move around, or you shift your body one way or the other and get off axis from the person, the sound will drop out. At least with an omnidirectional microphone, if you get it close enough to them, there will hopefully be enough balance of the source material versus the background material such that it's usable. Cardioid microphones, as I said, are slightly more directional than an omnidirectional microphone. If you want to exclude extraneous sounds and focus on what's directly in front of the microphone, a cardioid microphone will do that. But the trade-off is a slightly colored sound because of the process required to make the cardioid microphone behave that way. Quite often, the same capsule in a cardioid dynamic microphone is the same electronic component that's in the omnidirectional microphone. The difference being the cardioid version of that microphone will have a tuning chamber behind it to basically enable it to reject sounds from the rear, where the omnidirectional microphone of the same thing will not have that tuning chamber. The trade-off, of course, is an increase in handling noise and a much more pronounced proximity effect. With an omnidirectional microphone within a certain range, no matter how close you get or how far away you get from the person, it's not going to be as pronounced as with a cardioid microphone, whereas the closer you get, the more pronounced and bassier the person's voice will be. A hypercardioid microphone has its uses, but as with anything more directional, as you get more directional, the handling noise and sensitivity to handling noise increases. You'll also notice that the side and rear lobes start to develop a little bit in a hypercardioid microphone. Hypercardioid microphones are of course more directional than cardioid microphones, but as you make a microphone more and more directional, you will notice from the polar plots shown from above that the rear and side lobes start to develop and become more pronounced. The sensitivity to handling noises, of course, goes up. If you look at these three microphones, you'll notice the difference between them is the vents on the sides of the body right behind the capsule. The more vents and the longer the vent space is behind the capsule, the more directional it becomes. Basically, these vents allow sounds coming from the rear of the microphone to be canceled out internally. A true condenser microphone will achieve its difference in polar patterns by manipulating voltage and phase within the capsule. As you can see from the shotgun microphone, the bulk of its length is covered in vents. One incorrect assumption many people make is that in a shotgun microphone, the capsule is at the end of the microphone. It is not. It is back behind the vents closer to the connector on the microphone. That's because the physical principle that makes a shotgun microphone work is the same idea if you were to take an empty paper towel roll and hold it up to your ear. But think of that same thing in miniature and, of course, more finely tuned. Most shotgun microphones are typically electrets and typically are examples of the RF tank circuit I described earlier. Another pattern rarely discussed is the hemispherical polar pattern. This is found in some lavalier microphones and in most type of boundary layer microphones, including PZMs and the popular PCC 160. In these demo clips coming up, I've taken a variety of microphones and built a polar plot analyzer. In the real world, as described in a previous episode, this would be done in an anechoic chamber. But we don't have the budget for one of those, so we'll get the next best thing. You will notice the microphone is mounted on a box with a motorized turntable underneath it. The microphone starts out pointed at a speaker with a 1 kilohertz tone coming out of it. In a true test of such a microphone, the microphone would be swept from 20 hertz to 20 kilohertz, and the response for each frequency band would be plotted out. We don't have the time for that or the equipment to do it correctly. So we will stick with a 1 kilohertz tone for every microphone we analyze, just to keep it consistent and to make a good illustration. This microphone is a DPA 4053 with a nose cone attachment, which looks somewhat like a bullet. The effect that this bullet cone has on the microphone is it makes the microphone into a completely pure omnidirectional microphone at all frequencies. Most omnidirectional microphones aren't completely pure. They have little imperfections in the rear lobes. This particular microphone has none of those problems. This microphone is a DPA 4091, also an omnidirectional microphone, but a much less expensive one. This microphone is a vintage AKG D224E, which is a hypercardioid dynamic microphone. This dynamic microphone actually has two diaphragms inside of it. One for the front and one for the rear, and there's some electronic voodoo inside that makes the thing directional by combining the two diaphragms. This microphone is a Schoeps MK47 capsule. It's a hypercardioid condenser. This capsule is commonly used in a lot of film and television dialogue recording. Also used in a lot of classical recording, although in most classical recordings, quite often it's a cardioid or an omnidirectional version of this same capsule that is most popular. This microphone is a vintage RCA 74 ribbon microphone. It is a figure of 8 microphone. This microphone is a Milab LSR 1000 handheld cardioid microphone. And this microphone is a Sennheiser MKH 416T shotgun microphone. And this microphone is a DPA 4080 hypercardioid lavalier microphone and is in fact the same microphone that I'm wearing right now. This series of audio clips demonstrates how the various microphone polar patterns and microphone types behave in a live performance environment. The first one is a full mix of everything, the full band, the whole 9 yards.
Gonna mumble like you're crazy. Hey mambo, don't want to tarantella. Hey mambo, no more mozzarella. Hey mambo, mambo Italiano. Try the enchilada with a fish.
The second clip is just the drum kit by itself. There are 5 microphones on the drum kit. One in front of the kick drum mic is a vintage AKG D12. This snare has a Beyer N422. The hi-hat has a DPA 4011, and the two underhead mics, as opposed to the typical overhead position for the microphones, are DPA 4035s. The reason I use underheads in this situation is partly for a stage look and partly because it simplifies the sound of the drum kit. They're used to split the floor tom, the mounted tom, and the cymbals pretty much evenly. The next clip is just the 2 overhead mics by themselves. As we listen to all these clips, please pay attention to how much stage bleed is picked up by the different microphones. Bear in mind the 2 drum overhead microphones are omnidirectional microphones, and compare how much stage bleed there is in those compared to some of the more directional microphones used in other places on the stage. This next clip is from 2 microphones placed inside the piano. In this case, there were 2 DPA 4023s I have magnetic mounts attached to the harp inside the piano with the lid open to the short stick on the side. These two microphones are cardioids. Pay attention again to the relative bleed. Now this is somewhat exaggerated because the mics are inside the piano, more so than if they were outside. Next is two of the 7 saxophone microphones. Even though there are more than 2 instruments in each of the sections of the band, I only use 2 from each just to make the examples as similar as possible. Next are 2 of the trombone microphones. Those were DPA 4028 wide cardioid condensers. Wide cardioid is somewhat in between an omnidirectional microphone and a cardioid. It's about halfway between. Next up are 2 of the trumpet microphones. In this case, the trumpet microphones were a pair of Nady RSM4 ribbon microphones, which are figure of 8 microphones. Next up is the isolated vocal track, which was a wireless Sennheiser E835 cardioid dynamic capsule.
Hey mambo, mambo Italiano. Hey mambo, mambo Italiano. Oh, 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 mixed up Siciliano. Oh, you Calabrese gonna mumble like you're crazy. Hey mambo, don't want to tarantella. Hey mambo, no more mozzarella. Hey mambo, mambo Italiano. Try the enchilada with.
And this is the pair of shotgun microphones mounted on the downstage lip of the stage, pointed out into the room, where you can also hear again the relative amount of bleed coming from the stage and what's coming from the PA and being picked up by the shotgun microphones. This set of examples is from a live performance of a ballet with a full orchestra. The first example is the full show mix with multiple microphones within the orchestra. The next example is from the PC C160s, which were placed on the downstage lip of the stage facing upstage, which normally are put there to pick up any sort of tap dancing or incidental noises the dancers might make. So if they had a fake sword fight scene or something like that, we might use it to pick that up. Generally speaking, you don't want to amplify the sound of ballet dancers' footfalls because it makes them sound somewhat clumsy if you were to do so. This next example is from the shotgun microphones aimed at the crowd for audience response, clapping, cheering, whatever the case might be. And this final example is from a pair of omnidirectional microphones hung about halfway back in the house from the catwalk. This song clip I'm about to play is an excellent example of where a figure-8 microphone comes in handy. The fiddle player is in an isolation booth by himself, with the guitar player / vocalist in the other room by himself. The sound of the guitar is a combination of the pickup built into the guitar combined with a stereo that is 2-microphone XY array pointed at the body of the guitar. Since he is singing and playing at the same time, I opted to use that same RCA 74 ribbon microphone you saw earlier as a vocal mic, using the side lobe to reject the sound of the guitar to minimize the bleed into the vocal mic in case we had to do any repairs later on.
As I was going over the Cork and Kerry mountain, I met with Captain Farrell and his money he was counting. I first produced my pistol, Lord, and then produced my rapier. Sing a stand and deliver for the devil, he may take you with a ring. Dum-a-doo-dum-a-da. Back fall my daddy-o, back fall my daddy-o, there's a whiskey on the jar.
Well, that's all for this episode of Mr. Warren's Audio Hood. Please join us again soon for the next exciting episode of Mr. Warren's Audio Hood, audio and AV training for the real world.